The day I was arrested, I was working in the clerk's office at the Court of Appeal for the state of Louisiana. I had just come back into the office from lunch. I was at my desk, and I remember the sheriff deputy called me and said that someone wanted to see me. And so I walked up to the desk, and I was told to put my hands behind my back. And that was it. I don't think I had said another word except what were they arresting me for? And I remember the detective saying, do you really want me to say? If I do all the things that I'm supposed to do and I'm still liable to be criminally prosecuted just by virtue of living with HIV, then that's a problem.
Robert is a long-term survivor living with HIV and a prominent leader in the global HIV movement. As a Black gay activist, he brings a unique perspective to his more than a decade of experience in decriminalization, human rights, and social justice.
How I ended up addressing HIV criminalization is because I experienced it after a relationship that I was in, and the person that I was involved with accused me of not disclosing my status to them. And of course, I felt I had disclosed, but what I've learned over the years is that people respond differently to a lot of different things. And in this case, as two Black gay men being intimate together, HIV seems to be that thing that splits us apart. Yes, I contracted HIV, and I'm living as a person living with HIV, but to be a sex offender, to be a convicted felon, and to have to go to prison, these are things that my folks did not raise me to experience. And so if I actually went to prison, that means anybody in this room, and especially if you're Black and gay and living in the South and living with HIV, there's a potential that you will find yourself in prison. That is a fact. And for those of you who have not experienced that, thank God. My name is Robert Suttle, and I consider myself a movement leader who addresses HIV criminalization here in the U.S. I ended up in this HIV criminalization experience based on a relationship that ended, and my HIV status came into question, and as a result, I was arrested and I was prosecuted and eventually convicted of the intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. And based on that conviction, I ended up serving a 6-month prison sentence in state prison, as well as having to be on the sex offense registry. I was diagnosed in 2003, and when I learned about my HIV status, I did not immediately disclose it to my family. I was in a state of shock. I felt like a zombie. My family also did not, to my knowledge, understand that I was gay. People have made accusations that I was gay in my family, but these are not things that I told anybody within my family. Like most people newly diagnosed, you're not automatically given the skills to negotiate how to disclose your status. I did disclose my status to the guy that I was involved with, and I say that to say I felt I disclosed. However, when the issue of my HIV status came up in front of another mutual friend, his reactions was different. And so, of course, the relationship was ending at that time. So I think bringing this issue back up was probably embarrassing for both of us. And unfortunately, it led to charges pressed against me for allegedly not disclosing it. And as a result, I found that to be one of the most embarrassing moments of my life because I lost my job. I was arrested at work. My home was searched. And the fact that I'm living with HIV was made public through a newspaper publication. And so my family found out about all those things in that instance. The law in Louisiana requires that if you're living with HIV that you should disclose your status prior to engaging in any type of sexual activity. And if you don't, then of course you're now criminally liable for intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. I was looking at 10 years in prison, and so of course I took the plea simply because I just wanted it to be over. The sex offender registry really shouldn't have anything to do with a charge of an HIV crime. It doesn't make sense because this is not young person, it's not rape. It just does not fit the crime. Most people I found, when you share this information with them, they're like, why are you on the registry? It just doesn't make sense. Statistically, most people prosecuted for this crime in Louisiana are Black men. I was not expecting to leave Louisiana. However, I did end up leaving because I had an opportunity. I had started sharing my story publicly for the first time in other countries at these like high-level policy meetings where they were talking about HIV criminalization. And so I felt like this was a greater calling. So wherever I lived, I tried to register there in Pennsylvania, as well as New York, as well as DC. New York requires you to remain on the registry simply because of their sex offender law, even though they don't have an HIV-specific law. I don't think it's fair at all. I mean, I wasn't prosecuted here. And when you understand this issue, this doesn't make sense for anyone to be on the registry, let alone having to continue to be on the registry in a whole other state.
My name is Richard Joselson. I'm a supervising attorney with the Criminal Appeals Bureau of the Legal Aid Society in New York City. I've been working with Robert Suttle on his sex offender registration case. If you've been convicted of a felony in another state, and that felony requires that you register as a sex offender in that state, when you come to New York, you have to register here too, even if that crime isn't exactly equivalent to what might be a sex offense in New York. The crime of intentional exposure to HIV is a crime that's entirely unfamiliar to a New York practitioner. And that's because New York has nothing resembling that kind of crime in the penal law. Because the statute under which Mr. Suttle had been convicted was so alien to anything that we criminalize as a sex offense in New York, it occurred to us that this was a fight that we had to make. What I knew would happen in this case was that whatever legal positions of the courts and the various parties were going to be, none of the players in our system were going to be comfortable with requiring registration for this sort of statute. The court's concern was, though, that the SORA statute requires me to do it. It's a felony in another jurisdiction for which registration is required, and that's ultimately what the hearing judge decided. She had no choice under the statute. She had to require registration in this case. What if another state decides that sex outside of marriage is a crime for which registration is required, or sex involving adultery is a crime for which registration is required, or even consensual same-sex sexual activity? Currently, there's a United States Supreme Court case that protects against that, but we've seen recently that the United States Supreme Court is willing to reconsider and overrule precedent these days. So it cannot be, in our mind, that the analysis ends with the fact that it is a felony in another jurisdiction. That's the argument that we made in the appellate division. I wish I could tell you right here that that argument succeeded and that the story ends right there, but it doesn't. I mean, the appellate division essentially reached the same conclusion that the trial judge reached. I think it's interesting that, and maybe this does point a little bit of a way forward, that in their opposition to our request for permission to appeal, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office spent almost all of their papers explaining how bad they thought statutes like this were and how they would support an amendment to New York's Sex Offender Registration Act.
I feel that these HIV criminal laws are basically the greatest manifestation of stigma because it's enshrined in the law. We talk about stigmas, but we need to name the stigma. We need to say what type of stigma are we talking about, because you may think that stigma is just me as a person with HIV, that my feelings are hurt or that I'm feeling bad. But people living with HIV experience stigma on every level throughout their lives, whether it's based on their skin color, their gender, their sexuality, or anything about them. And so it's important, I think, to name the stigma, to be explicit about what type of stigma we're talking about. And of course, here we're talking about HIV criminalization.